The weekend had slipped away too quickly, leaving behind the cold embrace of Monday morning. He trudged through the near-empty parking lot, his breath visible in the crisp New Hampshire air. The office building loomed before him, a 4-story relic of forgotten ambitions and dull routines. Its glass doors reflected the dim gray sky, but behind them lay a darkness that had nothing to do with the lack of sunlight. He pulled open the heavy door, stepping inside to the sterile scent of old carpet and recycled air. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights barely masked the oppressive silence. The lobby was empty, just as it always was at this hour. He glanced at the elevator. Its doors stood closed, waiting like the gaping mouth of something hungry. He knew the ride to the second floor would be brief, yet it always felt like descending deeper into something unseen, something waiting. The moment the elevator dinged, he hesitated. The hallway stretched before him, long and vacant, lined with locked office doors. The shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. His skin prickled. He was alone. Yet somehow he wasn't. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, a hollow artery of empty offices and dead air. The walls, lined with frosted glass doors, bore the smudges of forgotten tenants, their rooms now silent tombs of abandoned desks and dust-covered chairs. Each step he took was swallowed by the thick industrial carpet beneath his feet, muffling all sound, as if the building itself was trying to erase his presence. The air carried a stagnant chill, a feeling of something left unspoken, lingering between the walls. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, their sickly glow barely pushing back the darkness creeping in from the corners. His office was at the very end of the corridor, past rooms that had long since ceased to hold life. But it was the office to his right that always caught his eye, the large vacant space behind a locked glass door. It was perfect, spacious, isolated. He often fantasized about his company moving there, away from the suffocating open floor plan he was forced to endure. Yet today, something was different. The glass reflected more than his own weary face. A shadow lingered inside, shapeless yet undeniably there, watching. He stopped. His breath hitched as his eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the glass. The empty office, the one he had passed every day, dreaming of a quieter space, was no longer empty. A figure stood inside. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting like thick smoke struggling to hold shape. Its edges blurred, bleeding into the surrounding shadows. And then, there were the eyes, 2 glowing red orbs, burning like embers in a dying fire, locked onto his own. They did not blink. They did not move. Yet he felt them pressing against him, peeling back layers of his mind, sinking deep into something he couldn't name. The air around him turned heavy, thick, as if gravity itself had changed. His skin crawled with an overwhelming sense of wrongness, an instinctual terror buried deep within his bones. His body screamed at him to run, but his feet remained frozen, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. Then the shadows inside the room shifted, just slightly, just enough. A cold dread snapped him back to reality. He turned, bolted down the corridor, his trembling hands fumbling with the key to his office. Behind him, the eyes remained, watching, waiting. He told himself not to look, not today. But his curiosity was louder than his fear. As he stepped onto the second floor, his heart pounded against his ribs. The dim corridor stretched before him, silent as ever. But something felt different, wrong. The air was colder. He swallowed hard, turning his gaze toward the glass door of the empty office. They were waiting for him. Not one, not two, but many. A cluster of shadowy figures loomed inside, shifting and writhing like living smoke. Their eyes, red, burning, endless, fixed solely on him. The sheer weight of their gaze pinned him in place, his breath caught in his throat. It felt as if his very soul was being pulled from his body, drained into the abyss that stood before him. A sinking despair gripped his chest, an overwhelming certainty that he would never feel happiness again. His vision blurred, his knees buckled. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him was the soft chime of the elevator door opening. Then, silence. A void. A whisper at the edge of his consciousness, and those eyes, still watching. The world came back in fragments. Muffled voices, a dim light, the distant hum of an overhead vent. His body felt heavy, his limbs weak, like he'd been drained of something vital. He was lying on a worn-out couch in the break room, the stale scent of old coffee hanging in the air. A man sat beside him, watching with cautious concern. He recognized him, one of the employees from the office next door. "You saw them, didn't you?" the man asked, his voice quiet, steady. A chill crawled up his spine. He didn't want to answer. If he said it out loud, it would make it real. The man sighed. "I've seen them too." His throat was dry, his mind still reeling. What are they?" The man hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I don't know. But they only appear when you're vulnerable. When you're drowning in stress, in fear, in sadness. That's when they notice you." A pause. Then a faint, almost sad smile. "Stay positive," the man said. "They feed on the darkness inside you. If you let it consume you, they will too." The night was still, suffocating in its silence. A massive tech company building stood against the dark sky, its sleek, futuristic design glowing eerily under cold blue lights. The air was thick, charged with something unseen. It was pristine, too perfect, almost sterile. Yet something about it felt wrong. The security guard arrived for his shift, stepping into the cold, lifeless structure. As the heavy glass doors slid shut behind him, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck, like he was being watched. But by what, or by whom, he dismissed it. After all, buildings don't breathe. Right. Inside the dimly lit security room, monitors flickered, casting an eerie glow over the lone guard. The soft hum of servers filled the air, a constant, droning presence. He sat at his desk, scrolling absent-mindedly through a blog, eyes occasionally flicking to the screens. It was routine, quiet, uneventful. But then, movement. A fleeting shadow on the second-floor walkway. A black figure, fast, too fast. His breath hitched as he turned, but the space was empty. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just a trick of the light, or so he told himself. But deep down, a cold unease began to settle. The hallway stretched before him, long and narrow, swallowed in shadows. The air was thick, dense with something unseen, something waiting. Overhead, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, some flickering, struggling to hold their glow. Each step the guard took echoed too loudly against the sterile white walls. The further he walked, the heavier the silence became. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnatural, like sound itself had been drained from the space. As he neared the open office area at the end of the corridor, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. He wasn't alone. He knew it before he saw it. In his peripheral vision, just to the right, something stood. A figure, motionless. Watching, his breath caught. His heart pounded in his chest. Slowly, instinctively, he turned his head. And there it was. A tall, faceless shadow. Humanoid, but not human. Black as ink, translucent, yet solid. Dreadlocks framed the emptiness where a face should be. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. And yet it was alive. A suffocating wave of fear crashed over him. Then, without a sound, it stepped back and melted into the darkness. The air lightened. The presence was gone, for now. Time stood still. The security guard remained frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. The office space ahead was dimly lit, the air thick and unmoving, but the shadow figure had been real. He had seen it, straight on. Not a trick of the light, not his imagination. It had shape, arms, legs, a head with short, unmoving dreadlocks. And yet, there were no eyes, no mouth, no features. Just a void where a face should be. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Then, the air shifted. A deep, suffocating cold crept over the room. He could feel it again. It was still there, lurking, waiting, blending into the darkness. His pulse pounded in his ears as he fumbled for his flashlight, hands trembling. He flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the space. Nothing. Just empty desks, silent monitors, and the distant hum of electronics. But he knew better. He had seen it. It had seen him, and it had stepped back, not to leave, but to watch. To wait. He wasn't alone in this building. Not anymore. The security office was brightly lit now. Every overhead fluorescent burning, pushing back the darkness. But no amount of light could erase the lingering chill in the guard's bones. He sat rigid at his desk, hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee, his knuckles white. His breath was steadying, but the fear remained, thick and suffocating. He turned to the monitors, eyes scanning the empty hallways, the silent office spaces. Everything looked normal. Too normal. But his gut told him otherwise. One screen caught his attention, a camera feed from the same office space where he had seen it. The room was empty, yet something was off. He leaned closer, squinting at the grainy footage. A shadow. Faint, nearly imperceptible. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was there, lingering, watching. His stomach twisted. He blinked, and in that split second the shadow was gone. The air in the office felt heavier again, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. His grip on the coffee cup tightened. He had turned on the lights. He had checked the cameras. He had done everything right, and yet he wasn't safe. Not here, not anywhere. The payday loan office sat in eerie silence, the hum of flickering fluorescent lights the only sign of life. Papers lay scattered across the desk, abandoned phone messages scribbled in frustration. An old coffee cup, its contents long cold, rested beside a dusty landline phone that occasionally rang, breaking the stillness. The air felt stale, heavy with the scent of old ink and worn-out carpet. Outside, the sky was an ominous shade of gray, thick clouds gathering like silent spectators. The large glass window reflected the storm's slow approach, a distorted image of the world outside. The small strip mall, usually bustling, was nearly empty. Just a flickering neon sign from the jewelry store next door, and the occasional blur of passing cars. The worker sighed, shifting uneasily behind the desk. It had been a slow day. A repossessed vehicle had been sitting in the lot for weeks, its owner long gone. A nagging unease crept in, a feeling that something was about to disrupt the monotony. The air felt charged, like the quiet before a thunderclap. Then, headlights. A black truck pulled in fast. Too fast. Something was wrong. The storm had arrived. The sound came first. The deep growl of an engine cutting through the silence like a blade. The office worker's eyes flicked to the glass door just as a black quad-cab Chevy pickup tore into the parking lot, tires screeching against the pavement. It didn't slow, it didn't hesitate. It slammed into the handicapped spot directly in front of the office, shaking the window with its force. Something about the truck was wrong. Its windows were too dark, swallowing the light instead of reflecting it. The black paint gleamed unnaturally, as if untouched by dust or time. The worker's pulse quickened. The driver's door groaned open. Then the passengers. 2 men stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black from head to toe. Their boots hit the pavement in perfect unison. Hats shadowed their faces, and dark sunglasses concealed their eyes. But it was their movements, too controlled, too synchronized, that sent a wave of dread crawling up the worker's spine. Guns. The polished grips of holstered weapons gleamed at their sides. The worker swallowed hard, willing them to go into the jewelry store next door. But they didn't. They were coming inside. The door swung open without hesitation, the small entrance bell giving a hollow chime before silence took over. The 2 men stepped inside, their boots hitting the linoleum floor in steady, deliberate thuds. The office worker froze, every muscle locking in place. They didn't remove their sunglasses. They didn't glance around. They just stood there, towering figures dressed in black, their presence soaking up the air like a void. The older man, broader in the shoulders, curled his lips into a slow, unsettling grin. The other remained motionless, his expression unreadable beneath the dim lighting. He was too still, too quiet. A cold sweat formed at the workers' temple. The weight of their guns, strapped to utility belts, was impossible to ignore. The room felt smaller, like the walls were pressing inward. Panic clawed at the worker's throat, but they forced out the words anyway. "How can I help you?" The question floated in the air, met with nothing but silence. The older man simply smiled wider, as if amused by the attempt at normalcy. The younger man didn't even blink. The office worker's fingers crept toward the panic button under the desk. The office worker's heart pounded like a war drum, echoing in their ears. Beneath the desk, trembling fingers searched blindly until they found the small, cold button, a silent prayer. Then, press. Once, twice. Again. Nothing changed. No alarms, no sirens. Just the suffocating silence stretching between them and the two men in black. The older man's grin didn't waver, his head tilting ever so slightly as if he knew, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The younger man still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't blinked. His presence felt less human, more like a statue cast in shadow. The worker's breath hitched. Was the panic button broken? Or was there simply no one listening? The air felt wrong, thick, charged, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The worker forced out a shaky, "What do you want?" Their voice didn't sound like their own. The older man exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. His smile never faded. And then, finally, he spoke. "We're here for the vehicle." The worker's stomach dropped. This wasn't a robbery. It was something much worse. The words hit like ice. The vehicle. The worker's mind raced. The repossessed bike abandoned for weeks. But why now? Why like this? The older man's grin never faded. He stood there, patient, amused, as if savoring the fear. The younger man remained motionless, like a shadow that had taken form. The worker swallowed hard. "You're the repo man." The words felt absurd. The older man gave the slightest nod. Something was wrong. No paperwork, no prior calls, no announcement, just two armed men appearing like specters in the dead air. The worker felt it now. This wasn't over. Flashing red and blue lights bled through the glass door, painting the walls in frantic color. Relief swelled in the office worker's chest until they turned back to the two men. They hadn't moved. No tension, no fear, no reaction. Just the same eerie stillness, as if the arrival of the police was nothing more than an inconvenience. The older man let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head slightly. The younger one remained an enigma. No words, no expression. No acknowledgement that anything was happening at all. The door swung open, two uniformed officers stepping inside, hands resting on their holsters. The worker shot up from the desk, breathless, desperate to explain. The words tumbled out. Armed men, no ID, no prior warning. The repo man. The officers exchanged a glance. One sighed. The other gave a half-hearted shrug. "Yeah, that's the guy. He does all the district's repossessions." The worker's mouth went dry. The officers weren't concerned. They weren't alarmed. The two men smirked. They turned, walking out as calmly as they had entered. The police said nothing, did nothing, and just like that, they were gone.